I apologize. Okay, fine. So today, we need to talk about pricing so that you can take the next exam. The next exam will be open from Monday to Friday of next week, so next week we won't meet. You will have that opportunity to take your exam. It will be on D2L. We need to talk about price. Prices of the four Ps, maybe the most critical, right? It's where all other business decisions come together is in the pricing model. So the price has to be right. What does that mean? Well, it has to be a price that consumers will accept. It doesn't matter if you have a great product or service. If they don't believe that the price is right, they're not going to buy from you, right? And so it has to be right. It obviously has to be enough to cover your expenses, or you're going to go broke, right? And hopefully make a profit. So pricing is enormously important. It represents what a consumer is willing to sacrifice for your product, right? So what are you willing, a lot of you drink energy drinks that I see you come in with, or Starbucks, which is like my favorite company to hate, is Starbucks. I tell students again, when we travel, if you mention the word Starbucks, I will leave you on the side of the road, because I absolutely believe that Starbucks and Chick-fil-A are the tools of the devil. And so I'm willing to not pay anything for a Starbucks, right? It doesn't matter how good the product is. I'm not willing to pay anything. I'm not willing to sacrifice my hard-earned money to buy from two companies that I believe are actually tools of the devil. The devil has many tools, and Starbucks and Chick-fil-A are two of them, right? As important as this is, obviously, and as passionate as I am sort of about the idea that this represents sacrifice, because we all work hard for the money that we earn, there is no unifying theory. Unlike ethics, where we can talk about theories of ethics and they are heavily theoretically grounded, there is a heavy amount of theory in how you go about developing a successful product or service and bringing it to market, and the steps that you need to take. There is no unifying theory with price. It's one of the most important decisions that businesses will make, is setting the price that they need to get in order to maintain profitability. And yet there is no unifying theory, other than we can say that you have to set a price that will allow you to make a profit, right? But beyond that, there are lots of goals that companies can have, and so there isn't a unifying theory. As important as this is, and as much as it represents where all of the other P's, product, promotion, and place, come together to represent whether or not you're going to be successful, no unifying theory to bring it all together, right? So price can be barter. And this goes on in a lot of countries. So, for example, I use the Kenya shilling here. Outside of Kenya, that currency has no value. Generally speaking, currencies are pegged to something, but nobody wants that outside of Kenya. It has absolutely no value. Now, most countries peg their currency to the dollar because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And what makes the dollar valuable? Well, in the past, when I would ask this question, and actually since I was born, because the year that I was born is the year that we changed over the system. If I said what backs up the US dollar, well, historically, we were on something called the gold standard, which meant that the dollar represented a certain amount of gold specie, right? That's not the case any longer. What is the dollar worth? It's worth what anybody's willing to pay for it. It floats on an open market. Richard Nixon floated the dollar in 1973, the year that I was born, which means that it's worth whatever. It's what we call fiat currency. What does that mean? It has value because people believe it has value. Why do people believe that the US dollar has value, and why did we become the world's reserve currency? Well, after World War II, there was something called the Bretton Woods Accords, and the US dollar was chosen as the world's reserve currency. The British actually wanted the pound sterling to be the world's reserve currency, but why is it the dollar? Because we had the largest economy in the world. And who rescued Europe from disaster during World War II? It was ultimately the United States, right? So we were the largest, most powerful country in the world. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency. The Kenya shilling is not worth anything outside of Kenya. So how do they engage? They still get goods and services. Well, they either have dollars to pay for them or they engage in barter. They trade stuff. So price can be barter. It can be, a negotiation. I'm going to sell you oil in exchange for rare earth minerals or something like that, right? And barter represents billions of dollars in domestic and international trade. On a much smaller scale, when do we see barter in everyday lives? Well, there are things called swap meets. How many of you have ever seen a swap meet? We have them in Guthrie all the time. There are these motorcycle swap meets or these tool swap meets, and people will go in like, I've got this and you've got that. I've got a wrench and you have, I don't know, a saw that I want. Will you trade wrenches for saws and things like that? So barter is one of the things that price can be, and it represents billions of dollars in domestic and international trade. The price equation and value. So price is the list price minus incentives and allowances plus extra fees. So the place where most of you will have experienced this full thing, right? Generally speaking, when you go to the grocery store, they don't give you the list price minus incentives and allowances. There's a price on the shelf for the groceries that you're going to buy, and that's just what it is. And you're going to go and take it up to the cash register or the self-checkout machine, and you're going to pay it. But technically speaking, the list price is minus incentives and allowances plus extra fees. Where most of you will have experienced this is in buying a car. So you look at the car, right? And there is something called the manufacturer suggested retail price. And then on the sticker of the car, there will be all of these other things that go into the price of the car, right? So there's the base manufacturer suggested retail price plus all of these sort of upgrades or customizations that have gone to the car. So if you buy a car, there's sort of the base model, right? When I was a kid growing up, the base model generally meant a couple of things that were going to distinguish it from a higher end model. Generally speaking, the base model when I was a kid growing up was a standard transmission. Standard transmissions were cheaper to manufacture than automatic transmissions, which cost more money. And so it was a standard transmission. Now that's no longer the case. And in fact, you can't really find standard transmissions in anything. So my brother, I love this. My brother has this classic model Porsche that has a standard Anybody know how to drive a standard in here? A couple of you know how to actually drive a standard. That's really unusual. Even trucks, when I was a kid growing up, the reason that trucks were not standards was because you couldn't get the torque and the pulling power in an automatic transmission. They weren't good enough to do that. Now, even heavy duty trucks. So I drove forever and ever and ever a Dodge 3500 dually, which I used to pull my horse trailers and my big boat. And that was an automatic transmission. When I was a kid growing up, they did not make 3500 Dodge, Ford, or F350s or 3500 Chevy Silverados in anything other than a standard, because that was the most efficient form of transmission. Now the transmissions have gotten so much better that they're actually better than a human being in terms of being able to figure out the torque, right, and things that you need. But the base model when I was a kid growing up was a standard transmission. Why is it that you know how to drive a standard? I'm just curious.
Me? I
Yeah.
grew up on a farm. I grew up on a ranch, and all of our feed trucks are standards.
Our standards. Okay. All right. Why do you?
Same thing.
Okay. I thought I'd asked if anybody grew up on a ranch in here or a farm, and nobody raised their hands.
Little brands.
So that's unusual right now. Most people don't know how to drive a standard. So my brother has this Porsche, the story I was telling you, and I love actually driving it because when my friends and I go to Dallas, we make our smallest friend. He's a very short little person. Sit in the back of the Porsche, and we'll go to all these places, and they have valet parking in all of Dallas because parking is a nightmare, right? So you go to valet parking, and I'll pull up and to the valet, and they're like, "Is that a standard?" And I'm like, "Mm-hmm." And they're like, "You can just leave it there. Just like leave it under the canopy," because they don't know how to drive a standard. They can't figure it out, right? So they're like, "Just leave it there. Just give us the keys and just leave it there." And I'm like, "If I give you the keys, are you gonna drive it?" They're like, "Oh no. You know, but we have to have the keys. That's policy, but no, we're not gonna drive it." Because they don't know how to drive it. So I grew up driving a standard transmission. So most cars were standards. So you'd look at the sticker, right, on the car. So you've all seen this, and it would say, like automatic transmission. That was a $1,500 upgrade at the time when I was growing up. And power windows, that was, a $1,200 upgrade. If you had leather interior versus cloth, that was an upgrade. So there would be all of these things, and then there would be these incentives, right? So if you financed with the company, if you financed with GMAC, they would take 10% off. If you would, if you were a member of the armed services, they would take another 5% off or something. So there were these incentives and allowances on the cars, plus the extra fees, which were things like for automatic transmission, the dealer prep, which is what is dealer prep? You're actually paying for those swag advertisements that the dealers put on the cars. They actually charge you for that. So where it says John Vance Motors on the back of the car, they're actually charging you that. So those extra fees. And that is the price. So it's the list price minus incentives and allowances plus any extra fees. Again, when you go to the grocery store, it will just say, bananas, $4.99 a pound or whatever it is today. And you don't see all these other things, but that is the price equation, is the list price minus incentives and allowances plus extra fees. Value is the benefits that the consumer believes that they are getting divided by the price. And 84% of US consumers say they equate higher price with higher quality. We believe that you get, this is an age-old saying, you get what you pay for, right? Now, in the modern world, most products are mass produced in factories, and there may not be much difference between the discount brand or store brand and the regular brand. Now, there are some things that I think that absolutely you can tell. Is there any difference, for example, between the Jolly Green Giant brand of green beans in the can and the Great Value brand? They're probably produced in the same canning facility, and there isn't much difference. Now, there are some exceptions to this with regard to consumer packaged goods that I will tell you that are absolutely, there is a big difference in quality. But in green beans or mixed vegetables in a can, between, the Libby's brand name and the Walmart store brand, which is Great Value, there's probably not a lot of difference. Where I think there are differences, macaroni and cheese. Like Kraft macaroni and cheese is, in terms of boxed product, I don't know what it is that they put in the cheese sauce of the Great Value or the off brand, but it just does not taste the same as the cheese sauce in Kraft macaroni and cheese, right? Or Kraft shells and cheese. Q-tips are another one, like the store brand, the Great Value store brand of Q-tip seems to have absolutely no cotton on the end of it. That's a difference. But with most things, there's probably not a lot of difference, but consumers still believe that there is, which is why we buy the labeled brands in many instances, because we have this perception that higher price equals higher quality. So decoding the price, this can be difficult. For example, with things like airline ticket fees, right? You get on Southwest and you look at the price, and then there are gate fees that are usually associated with that. If you fly on any, and Southwest is starting to do this too as well. Forever and ever and ever, Southwest was bags fly free. They're now considering whether or not they're going to continue that policy, or if they're going to continue having 2 bags fly for free, right? So it can be very difficult to decode the price. Consumers oftentimes fail to do the math. So for example, if you went, when I was a kid growing up, Foley's was one of the big name department stores. Now Foley's has been, Foley's went broke. They were bought out by Macy's. So Macy's was one of the big department stores. And Macy's started doing this thing where, and Macy's was a huge brand name, right? In the retail department store industry. Every Thanksgiving, Macy's sponsors the Macy's Day Parade in New York City, which is this huge parade. They have a huge big flagship store in downtown Manhattan, and they go right by the store with all of the floats that Macy's sponsors. But they started doing this thing where they were putting everything on sale, and they would have these what were called white sales, for example, and they would say everything in the store is 25% off plus an additional 25% at the register. And consumers a lot of times will assume that that means that the product is 50% off. It's not, right? If you have a product that's $100, right, and it's 25% off, if we do the math, that means that it's marked down, it's 25% off. So it starts out as $100 minus 25%, which means that it's marked down to $75, right? And then an additional 25% at the register, it's 25% of 75, which is not making it 50% off, right? But consumers don't do the math. They engage in sort of simplistic, combining, and you can't do that. So it's oftentimes difficult to decode, and consumers a lot of times fail to do the math and figure out what the actual price is. In the marketing mix, price affects everything that the firm does. It affects the total revenues that the firm will collect, right? So the more you can charge, the more revenues you have. It affects the total cost of the goods sold. If you are not able to charge enough because consumers don't perceive the value to be there, you will not make a profit. So profit equals total revenues minus total cost. Or another way of calculating it is the unit price quantity minus the fixed costs and variable costs for the goods sold. What are fixed costs? These are things like the rent that you have to pay on the facility that you are leasing, or the mortgage you have to pay on the facility that you own, if you own versus lease, plus variable costs. What are variable costs? Well, those are the costs that fluctuate. So one of the things that's a variable cost for lots of businesses is in procuring things, right? Transportation can be a variable cost because oil, for example, floats on an open market, and the cost to fill up your vehicles to go and get the supplies that you need may vary from week to week or even day to day, right? they change prices on the gas pumps frequently. And so that would be a variable cost. The supplies that you purchase may vary in relation to what you need. So for example, in my family's business, we've owned up to 7 bed and breakfasts at one time in Guthrie. We use an enormous amount of eggs, right? Because that's what bed and breakfast is. You provide breakfast historically for your guests. Now, that's not necessarily typical in the Airbnb world, but we are a traditional bed and breakfast and we provide breakfast, and that's generally a gourmet breakfast. That's why people go to a bed and breakfast, is it's about experiencing something different. And so we use an enormous amount of eggs. What's happened with egg prices recently? They've gone up. Why have they gone up? Well, there's inflation. There's also, they've had to kill a whole lot of birds because of avian flu, right? So there's been this huge increase in the price of eggs. It used to be eggs were really cheap. Eggs were maybe even, like an ideal protein source because they have an enormous amount of protein, and historically they were really cheap because it was cheap to get chickens. They grow rather quickly, they mature, and they start laying eggs fairly quickly. And so it was a rather cheap thing. As a result of COVID, and then sort of the international issues that we've had with tariffs and stuff like that, and then you have a pandemic in the avian population of your birds, and prices of eggs have gone through the roof. They're now, it was not atypical, even 10 years ago or less, to pay less than 25 cents an egg, right, for an egg. And now, depending on what kind of eggs you're buying, the eggs can be up to $1 an egg or more. If you're buying heirloom eggs, this has become a big thing. I've noticed this in the shelves in Texas. They haven't quite made it to Oklahoma yet, although I haven't looked at the eggs at Whole Foods to see if they have heirloom eggs there. I would be willing to bet they do. So these heirloom eggs, they're really interesting. They have them at H-E-B in Dallas, where my brother lives, and I love to look at them. They look like Easter eggs. They've got green and blue eggs, not just white and brown. Like if you go to Walmart, you're going to get either white or brown eggs, and that's about it. And the variations in those eggs are going to be whether or not it's organic or free range or something like that, but it's a white or brown egg. So these things have increased, and if you are buying heirloom eggs, they're over $1 an egg at H-E-B. So those are variable costs for my business. So pricing objectives. One of the things that you can do is you can price for profit. Now, American companies are often accused of engaging in short-term pricing in order to make their numbers, because we have SEC reporting requirements for publicly traded companies that make them want to show balance sheets that are better than maybe they are. And so they will engage in short-term strategies, whereas in other countries they engage in more long-term strategies. So a long-term strategy can mean foregoing immediate profit to penetrate a highly competitive market. So when you want to break into a market that's highly competitive, you might rely on your sort of stockpile of funds in order to engage in a penetration pricing, which means that you're going into the market and you're trying to undercut sellers in the current market. Return on investment is generally a short-term strategy. So lots of American companies are accused of this. Why is that? Well, again, because we have things like reporting of profits by SEC reporting companies that are publicly traded, they oftentimes will engage in short-term ROI. Quarter over quarter, which is also a short-term strategy. to talk about profitability. Sales, another objective may be to increase sales. How do you do that? How are you going to stimulate demand? Well, one of the things that Macy's did was, and the reason that they started having these white sales, and they were almost always constant, was they were trying to increase sales in the competitive marketplace of the department store arena. You might have a pricing objective that deals with market share. This is the ratio of the firm's revenues or units to those in the industry. McDonald's oftentimes does this. McDonald's is the largest producer in the fast food industry, right? They started losing out market share to Starbucks in one of their most profitable segments, which is the breakfast segment. And so they have engaged in pricing to try and engage in and increase their market share. Now, one of the ways they've actually done that is to try and become more, or appear to be more, of a unique sort of product, like Starbucks, by offering different kinds of McCafe drinks in the morning that are similar to Starbucks products. You can have a pricing objective for unit volume. Survival. A lot of firms are in survival mode, and so they're pricing just to try and stay in business, right? So that's one thing. This happened to FAO Schwarz. When I was a kid growing up, FAO Schwarz was sort of the gold standard in the children's toy market. And there were FAO Schwarz stores in sort of very posh locations, like the Country Club Plaza in Kansas City. I think that was probably the closest one to us. Actually, maybe Dallas. I think they had an FAO Schwarz in the Galleria, which was a very exclusive mall at the time. It's kind of sad. I go to the Galleria, and I remember as a child, like, we thought this was like we'd gone to Mecca. And now you kind of go to the Galleria, and you go to most shopping malls, and it's kind of a sad experience because they've become sort of passé, and they've been replaced by, it's not that we're not shopping, we're still shopping, right? How have they been replaced? Well, largely by Amazon. That's going to deliver it to you, for free, if you buy enough stuff, or if you're an Amazon Prime member, and that's more convenient than going out and shopping. When I was a kid, because we didn't have this device attached to us that had all of the entertainment that we might want in it, shopping was sort of a social pastime, right? Now, why would you want to go shopping when you can get on your phone and play Words with Friends or something like that? And so shopping malls have largely become sort of places that are dying. They have been replaced by what are called lifestyle centers, which is just fascinating to me that people would rather do this. So like in Dallas, there are these lifestyle centers. One of them is called Legacy. That's not very far from my brother's house in Plano. There's Legacy East and Legacy West, and these lifestyle centers are basically fake downtowns. They are imitating, they've got storefronts and stuff like that. And I'm like, why are you people out here? Like, it's not pleasant to be out in the weather in Dallas most of the time. It's either in the summer, exceedingly hot and humid, or cold and windy in the winter. And yet there are all these people, all of these stores, they've left the malls for these lifestyle centers, things like Filson, which is, sort of an outdoor supply company that my brother loves, that offers products that are like highly overpriced, in my opinion, for what they are: bags, hats, clothing. They've moved to these lifestyle centers, which are basically outdoor malls. They're fake. They are fake downtowns that mimic sort of the feeling of and create a nostalgia for that sort of deal. But FAO Schwarz is, one of these that was located. Country Club Plaza was an early version of the lifestyle center, and FAO Schwartz was there. When they were in their last years, they were just in survival mode and trying to stay afloat. They ultimately filed for bankruptcy. I think they're sort of still around. I think maybe they have a web presence, but largely they're gone. Another pricing objective that you can have is social responsibility. So some companies, and this is becoming enormously popular among companies that are started by people of my generation and younger. So I'm a Gen Xer, born in 1973. Those of you that are Gen Y or Gen Z, right? This has become a big thing. Social responsibility. So Tom's 1-for-1. What's another company that does a 1-for-1? So they're for every unit that they sell. So Tom's did this with shoes, and they were one of the first to do this, and it became very popular. And Tom's shoes caught on, and like your generation loved Tom's shoes. What's another company that does this? Bombas, right? So Bombas does a 1-for-1. So for every pair of socks that you buy, they donate a pair of socks to a homeless shelter, which means that they basically have to produce a good that is enough to cover the cost of giving one unit of product away to charity. So homeless shelters. Homeless shelters, socks are the #1 most requested item in homeless shelters, right? So 1-for-1. Social responsibility has become one of the big pricing objectives, particularly among companies that are concerned about social responsibility. So pricing constraints. Consumer demand is a pricing constraint. And I used to office in Thatcher Hall, which is the building across the sort of mall out, to the south of us. It's the building that the ROTC is in. There's a large cannon out in front of that building. I don't think you should be scared of that. I don't think the cannon is actually live. I think they pulled out the firing pin of the cannon. It was interesting when I officed in that building because students would say things like, I would hand back tests when we still did exams on Scantrons and stuff like that. And if you didn't come to class, I taught the large section of marketing, which was in the lecture hall, the Troy Smith lecture hall downstairs. And students would say, "Can I see my test? I want to see my test." And I would be like, "I brought it last time. If you don't have it, you'll have to come to my office to get it." And that might as well have been the Sahara Desert, because students were not, they're like, "Where's your office?" And I would say, "It's in Thatcher Hall on the 3rd floor." And they're like, "Oh, forget it. I'll just not worry about it." And they, might as well have, like I said, been the Sahara Desert that I was asking them to cross. So consumer demand. The reason I tell you the story is the woman who was across the hall from me for years and years and years was an economist named Dr. Jean Caldwell. And I got so sick every semester of students going to her office because they didn't understand the supply or demand curve. And she would say, "Now you have to remember that supply is the whole curve." And after I heard that for the 50th time every semester, I wanted to run over and scream, "What don't you get about supply is the whole curve, demand is the whole curve?" I got this the first time somebody said it to me, but there were always these students that they're like, "I just don't understand." So when we talk about, you have to distinguish between movement along the curve versus a shift in the entire curve. In this example, right? So we're going, this is units and this is price. We're going from 500, and I know it's hard to see, to 600. This is a shift in the entire curve. It means that at every point along the curve, so it's the whole curve, consumers are willing to pay more money, right? Along the entire curve, right? So you have to distinguish between movement along the curve versus the actual curve itself and a shift in the curve. What can cause a shift in the curve? Well, if consumers have more money, because we have something like full employment, right? that could be something that causes a shift in the full curve, that people are, if they have more money to spend, they may be willing to tolerate higher prices, right? That generally is a result of inflation. One of the things that we see in the current economic time is that we have experienced some inflation in the last couple of years that has been more significant than it was for many, many years. I was born again in 1973, so I remember the inflationary period of the 1980s when prices were going through the roof and there was hyperinflation because, interest rates were really, really high and there was an oil shock and things like that. So, consumer demand. If the money supply shrinks and if unemployment is high, for example, you could have a shift in the curve the other direction, and people would have if they have less money, they're willing to pay less for your product, right? So consumer demand is one of the pricing constraints that we have to deal with. Cost of production and marketing. Over the long term, you have to cover your costs. Now, some companies will engage in loss profit or loss pricing in order to penetrate the market, but over the long term, you can't do that. Standard Oil did this. They would go in and they would say, I want to buy your oil company. And when these little independent producers would say, I don't want to sell, they would move in across the street, cut the prices, and put them out of business, right? And then they would raise the prices because they would then have sort of a monopolistic environment, right? The newness of the product and the product life cycle. When things come out, people might be willing, if they are early adopters and it's something that's really cool, to pay higher prices initially to get the first crack at it, right? If you think about this, when I was a kid going to the movies, there were there were actually three types of movies. We now have a remnant of that in Guthrie. So there were first run movie theaters. Those were the ones that had all the new releases. Then there were the dollar movie theaters, which made their money off of selling basically popcorn and candy and drinks and selling movie tickets really, really cheaply, but they got movies that were older, right? And then there were drive-ins, which was sort of the best. Now, in Guthrie, we actually have, if you're interested in this and you're interested in nostalgia, we have one of only, I think, 3 first-run drive-in movie theaters in the nation. So we have a drive-in movie theater in Guthrie, and it's actually not a second or third run movie theater. It's a first run, so you can see the latest releases in Guthrie at the drive-in movie theater. Why have most of those drive-ins and why have most movie theaters? A lot of them have gone broke. Well, as we've been able to put in better and better quality televisions in our home and larger screens for less money. When I was a kid, buying a big screen television that would sort of mimic a movie theater experience was really, really expensive. Now you could buy these enormous screens that have better quality than you're going to see in the movie theater at home. And so movies have, recently struggled. And also the fact that they are releasing movies almost instantly to streaming platforms. Even big budget movies that you want to see, they're releasing to streaming services really, really quickly. And so, historically though, if you wanted to see the newest, and when I was a kid, there were several of the franchises that were really big deals. One of them was Star Wars. And I don't know if you all have watched the Star Wars franchise. Disney has an entire theme park area in Disney World in Orlando, modeled on Star Wars, and you get to go in and experience a flight on the Millennium Falcon. This was a big deal. When that movie came out, and when the second one and the third one came out, those were like, all of my friends could not wait to go see this movie, right? And so it was a very new thing. You wanted to be able to be the first to have seen it and be able to go to school and talk about, did you see, Star Wars? And I can't even remember what they were called now, after the first one, but the various episodes of Star Wars, people were willing to pay higher ticket prices to go see that movie in first run if you were a huge fan of that franchise, right? So that was dependent on the product life cycle. If they released a movie, that's a fairly new thing in the product life cycle. Is it a single product versus a product line? That can be a constraint on pricing. Are you selling one thing or are you selling multiple things? When I was in industry in the American Education Corporation, we had this product that was a really fantastic product for teaching students to read. And it was called Learning Letter Sounds, I think. So we used that product, and the accounting department consistently wanted us, because it was our least profitable product line, they consistently wanted us to get rid of that product. And we would be like, we're not getting rid of that product, Neil, who was our CFO, because that's the product that gets us in the door. When superintendents are worried, so during the Bush administration, they had an act called No Child Left Behind, which focused on high stakes testing of students at various points in their academic career to make sure that they were at grade level. And that was a big deal. It was the idea behind No Child Left Behind was that we were going to end what the Bush administration called social promotion. Anybody know what social promotion is? This became sort of fashionable, I guess, in probably the 1960s or 70s, social promotion. Don't know what that is. So the idea was that you would go ahead and promote students to the next grade, even if they weren't at grade level, and hope that they would catch up in order to not create a stigma in the mind of the student that they were behind, right? So there was this movement to promote students along with their peers so that you didn't have somebody, for example, who was 18 and still a high school sophomore. And so the Bush administration says we got to end that. Social promotion had actually been sort of outlawed in most states by the time the Bush administration came along, but they really focused on this. And so they engaged in a series of high stakes testing, which is if you wanted to receive federal funding, you had to prove that most of your students were at grade level, that you were providing a quality education. Now, the way they did that was, in my opinion, it's a worthy goal, but focusing on one test on one day when students can be sick or not feeling well places an enormous amount of pressure. But what it did was, for the company that I worked for, is it opened up a huge revenue source for us, because one of the things that they tested was, and George W. Bush was adamant about, because his wife Laura had been a high school librarian, and so she really focused on reading. One of the ones that was a big portion of the No Child Left Behind was the reading test. Well, Learning Letter Sounds was a fantastic way of teaching reading to students, right? So we had this product, it allowed us to get into the door, and then we could sell more products to the school. So we weren't just selling a single product, we had an entire product line. What was that? Well, it was a learning management system combined with content, assessment, and testing, right? So, or assessment and testing are the same thing, but monitoring, so that you could see whether or not students were progressing along this sort of path towards grade level. And that was one of the things that we had. So we weren't just selling a single product, we were selling an entire product line. And we used Learning Letter Sounds as sort of our loss leader in order to get our foot in the door. And then school districts would realize the benefit that we had. But if you're selling just one product, right, that's a whole different thing. If you can't engage in sort of the ability to bundle, if all you're producing is one thing, that can be one of the things that can be a price constraint. The cost of changing prices in the times. Now, this is one of the things that has gotten very, very rapid, and we can engage in dynamic pricing. That's what the airlines do. That's what hotels do. That's why when you travel, hotel prices will vary depending on the season, right? Because they're engaging in dynamic pricing. In the past, this was a big deal. If you took out an ad, for example, in a newspaper or a magazine, you were committed to that price for the life of that ad, right? So how long is that magazine, from magazine run to magazine run? Whereas now we can change prices via the web almost instantaneously. The type of competitive market also influences the price and whether or not you can engage in, sort of quality pricing or higher pricing. So revenues. Total revenue equals the price times the quantity sold. Average revenue is your total revenue divided by the quantity sold. So total revenue divided by quantity is your average revenue. The marginal revenue is the change that results from producing one additional unit of product. In many instances, to produce more products doesn't necessarily raise the price until you get to a certain point, right? And then you have to start thinking about, for example, if you're manufacturing a tangible good, are we going to have to build, if we produce one more unit, are we going to have to build more space or engage in more, purchases of lines or increasing employees to produce the products? Price elasticity is the change in the quantity that is demanded divided by the change in the price. Now, when we talk about elastic versus inelastic, so elastic means that there is a large decrease in demand if you increase the price. Versus inelastic, where a 1% increase in price produces less than a 1% decrease in demand. Now, lots of textbooks will say things like gas is an example of an inelastic price. Is that true? I don't think it is. Because when gas gets to about $5 a gallon, you see a huge change in consumer behavior. So I like things that go. I like fast horses. I like fast cars. I like fast airplanes and fast boats, right? Anything that goes, I have a tendency to like it. So I had a huge, big, until very recently, a huge, big 36-foot cabin cruiser at Lake Eufaula, and then we moved it to Lake Texoma when my brother moved back from New York, and he brought his boat down so that we could be on the same lake because he was in Plano. So I moved the boat, right? When if gas is $5 at the pump for a car, it's going to be considerably more than that on a lake. And if you have a 36-foot cabin cruiser, which my boat had twin Volvo Pentas, so big block Volvo Pentas, which meant that it consumed an enormous amount of petroleum products. When gas gets to be $10 at the marina, so it's not like a boat that you can pull out of the water and take to the gas station and fill up. When gas gets to be about $10 at the marina, what do you see happening at the marina? Well, you see people sitting on the dock with their big boats rather than going out on the lake, right? So it had two gas tanks, one for each motor. Each gas tank held 100 gallons. So, that's a lot of gas. And you could, if you open the throttles to get it up on plane, to get the boat going, it would go 55 miles an hour on plane. And you would burn, so when I sold the boat, I had one guy come by and look at it, and he's like, how many miles per gallon does it get? And I'm like, there's no miles per gallon on the lake, right? Like, it can consume gallons per minute, right? If you get it up on plane, it could go through in an hour and a half, it could go through 200 gallons, right? If you flat out, pushed both throttles forward and ran the boat full out, it could consume literally lots and lots of petroleum products in a matter of minutes. When gas prices get high, people are not doing that, right? They're sitting on the dock, or if they go out, they're going out one day a week on the lake. They're not getting the boats up on plane. They're going very slowly and conservatively. And when gas prices reach about $5 a gallon, what happens to our driving patterns? Well, we have a tendency to start combining trips, right? So you're no longer, rather than just running to the store, if you forget something, you're gonna do without it, or you're gonna plan, like, okay, I have to go to UCO on Mondays and Wednesdays to teach my class, and I'm gonna go do my shopping on those days for my business, rather than doing my shopping on Friday, which is when I normally do it, right? That's what when gas prices got to be $5, I was literally, because again, I had a big truck, 3,500 Dodge Dually. I would buy groceries on days that I came to UCO, even though, that meant that I didn't have help on those days, usually unloading and things like that, because our bed and breakfast staff, who are primarily a weekend traffic, are there on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays, right? Unitary is where you have 1% increase leads to a 1% decrease in demand if you have unitary. So you have elastic, inelastic, and unitary. Arriving at the final price. You can have demand-oriented pricing, in which you engage in things like skimming. This is usually used by innovators, and it comes from, for those of us that were born and raised on farms, skimming the cream off of the milk, right? So when you milk a cow, you get cream and milk, so that there are various parts of it. Homogenization does something that makes the milk consistent, right? And they separate it out, and so you get various products, like you get heavy whipping cream. That's the part of the cream that you can turn into like a dessert, like custard, right? Or half and half, which is what they use in coffee, or milk, then skim milk, or 1% milk, right? So skimming is used by innovators, where they release something that's new. When Apple released the first iPhone, it was brand new, and people were willing to pay a premium to have that product, right? The opposite of skimming is penetration pricing, where you try to, in a competitive market, penetrate. Why does skimming work for Apple? There are not a lot of competitors in the cell phone market, right? And so Apple relied on the fact that their product was, at the time that they released it, the newest, latest, and greatest and coolest thing, right? That doesn't work in a highly competitive market where you have lots of people in the market. So you might have to use a penetration pricing if you want to get in. In consumer packaged goods, largely, there's lots of clutter and lots of competition in the space for those things. Prestige pricing occurs when you want to say this is something that's quality. Again, 84% of consumers say that price is directly related to the quality of a product. So forever and ever and ever, TAG Heuer sold watches, and the price point of their watches was something like $500 for the average TAG Heuer watch, right? So they wanted to be seen as more like Rolex. So they raised their prices on their watches, and their sales actually increased. They engaged in marketing with celebrities, and they raised their average price from $500 to $1,000. Now it's more than that now, right? But they went from $500, which is not a cheap watch. What's a cheap watch? Timex. What can you buy? Historically, could you buy a Timex for? I don't know, $20, right? Less than $100. So TAG Heuer, $500 is a lot more expensive than $20, but Rolex prices started at that point in time at about $1,500 for a non-date. The cheapest model of Rolex is called an Air King, and it's a mechanical watch. It is an Oyster Perpetual, but it doesn't have a date on it, right? And so those started at the time that TAG Heuer did this at about $1,500. They now are about $5,000, I think, for the cheapest model of Rolex. TAG increased their prices to $1,000. At $1,000, they were seen more like Rolex than they were like Timex. And it actually increased their sales because they were viewed as a more prestigious product. Price lining is pricing your product where you assume that demand is inelastic between price points. So you'll have 3 different sets of products, maybe, that are all in the same category, and you'll set the price, for example, at $10, $20, and $30 for, pairs of pants or something like that. Odd even pricing strategies, demand-oriented. This plays into the mind of the consumer. So if you set something at $5.99, it's actually what? It's actually $6, but in the mind of the consumer, it's less than, right? I mean, at $5.99, you're really at $6, but it's seen as less than. Targeting is where you actually try to establish what most consumers will pay, and then you back into that price through, trying to manufacture the product, or provide the service at the price that you think that most consumers will pay. So you back into the price. Bundle pricing has become popular among lots of things, right? So we now bundle lots of products with regard to, for example, the operating systems of our computers and things like that. You're buying a suite of products like Microsoft Office, right? Which has Word and Excel and all these other products. Yield management, this relies on surge pricing. It's a dynamic pricing technique, and it started with the airlines. Now hotels and all kinds of other people engage in yield management, where they dynamically price based on whether or not people are demanding product, right? So it changes. Airline ticket changes depending on what day of the week you want to leave on and what time of day, right? That you are wanting, and then where you also want to go. You can have cost-oriented pricing. That's where you have something like a standard markup. So for example, supermarkets and in the food business, they rely on volume. the standard markup forever and ever and ever, and this is no longer true because we've had inflation and they've had to adjust prices, but it was something like 3%, right? So they would take the price and then add 3%. You can have cost plus pricing where you mark it up just cost plus 10, 20, 30, 40%. You can have profit-oriented pricing where you set a target profit that you want to make. There was a guy in Guthrie who actually did this. He had a donut shop, and I remember when he opened it, I was I think a sophomore, and he opened this donut shop. It was called Spud Nuts, which are donuts that are made out of potato, so they're like a potato bread product. And he decided that he wanted to make $30,000 a year, so he figured out how many donuts he had to produce, and he would produce that many donuts, and he stayed open until he sold every donut for the day. And the minute he sold the last donut, he closed. So the business was open it was always open at 5:30 in the morning, but when he closed was dependent on when that last donut was sold. You can have a target return on investment or return on sales. In highly competitive, you will oftentimes find competitive oriented type pricing strategies, which are things like customary pricing. What's sort of the customary price in the market? So, hotel rooms, for example, they may be dynamically priced, and you could have a variation of these. But what is sort of the standard price that people are willing to pay? At, above, or below pricing. And then loss leader pricing is where you price something below in order to get people to get into the store. Historically, in supermarkets, things like before and when we had milk subsidies, when milk was subsidized, those would be loss leader prices for a lot of supermarkets. That's no longer the case because they don't subsidize milk, but they would, or we don't have as big as subsidies on milk as part of the farm acts as we used to, where they would price it below in order to get you in, and then hoping that you'll buy other stuff once you're in the store. Any questions about price? All right. Well, again, next week